All right.
Sorry.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jack, and of course, I know Victor here. I know John Griffin very well. Thank you for bringing Lua to our life. She's wonderful, and we love her like a member of the family, an exchange student who's been with us many years now. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about Mars this morning. When I was a little child in the 50s, I was watching all those films like Invaders from Mars, Flight to Mars, Rocket Ship XM, The Angry Red Planet. When everybody else was out playing Little League Baseball, I was on the couch reading science fiction. I had no doubt that there was life on Mars, etc., etc. Okay, here's Mars, the Angry Red Planet, the Roman god of war. If you took the 7 continents here on Earth and made them into a planet, they would be precisely the size of Mars. If you went there and walked on the surface, you would weigh 38% of what you weigh here on Earth. She is red because there just has a massive amount of iron ore on the planet. Okay, it puts Western Australia to shame. The temperature ranges, if you're at the North or South Pole on a cold winter night, it'll drop down to minus 248 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're right on the equator in a summer day, it'll go up to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the normal day around here, if we're lucky. So, Mars lacks something very important that the Earth has, a magnetic field. And this means that the atmosphere got stripped away long ago by the sun and other elements. It has 1% of the atmosphere that the Earth has. That's equivalent to being at 100,000 feet here on Earth. In my 47-year flying career, I've been up to 42,000 feet. If there's some jet fighter pilots in here, you may have made 50,000. If there's somebody here who was lucky enough to be among the wealthier folks or have a great corporate expense account, you've been up to 60,000 feet on the Concorde, where friends of mine who have done it have said you can see the curvature of the Earth, etc., etc. I've never had that experience. To get to 100,000 feet, you can only go up there in a special balloon. You can pay $200,000 to Virgin Galactic and ride up on their space plane when it becomes operational. Or if you get the X-15 out of the Smithsonian, you can take a ride on that. That's how high it is. So you're not going to be on the surface of that planet outside without a spacesuit. Okay? And when we talk about Mars, the first thing that comes to mind is my dear wife. She says, Jack, we have too many problems here on Earth. What are we doing spending all this money on foolishness like this? Okay, this is a matter of interest. The whole NASA budget is probably $17 to $19 billion a year. The federal government budget is well over $1 trillion. So we're talking about 1% of the federal budget is spent on space. Okay, and there was an incredible lady. There is an incredible lady named Mary Roach who started with this skeptical attitude, why spend all this money for this foolishness? And she set out and wrote a book called Packing for Mars. And she really did it thorough. She even went to Russia and trained to be a cosmonaut. She never actually flew in any space flight, but she went through all the training, did an incredible in-depth study. And one of the most fascinating things from this book is if you go to the International Space Station or you plan to go to Mars, you have to learn how to use the toilet, okay? Now, when we were all little kids, for the most part, our mothers taught us how to use the toilet. Now, in space, it becomes a huge problem if, shall we say, one has to take a seat and defecate, okay? In fact, any cosmonaut or astronaut going to the International Space Station or on a long space flight has to go to the Johnson Space Center in Houston and go through a 2-week course to learn how to use the toilet. Okay?
Two-week course.
It's honestly, gosh, it's a 2-week course. And space is not a glamorous place. Forget what you've seen on Star Trek and all these movies like that. It's brutal, cold, one little equipment failure or one little mistake and you die very rapidly. Those of you who have seen the movie Gravity, you got an idea of what it's like. And so Mary went through all these things, and at the end of the book, she talked about all these negatives and is it really worth it? And then her final words in the book were, what in the heck? If they don't spend the money on this, they're not going to spend it on social programs, so let's go ahead and do it. Okay? And always a big question is, why do we need to send humans to Mars? And there's one overriding imperative, something called a species-ending event. Probably most of you are familiar, some 65 million years ago, a big meteor struck the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and allegedly wiped out all the dinosaurs. We have evidence of two other similar strikes going back millions and millions of years, one in the Permian Basin in West Texas and one in India. Both of these were cataclysmic, life-ending events, okay? Closer to home, you have Yellowstone National Park, which is a huge super volcano. If it goes off, that by itself would not be a species-ending event, but it would be cataclysmic. There's 11 other volcanoes like that around the world. Now everybody's sitting here saying, well, so what, Jack? The meteor hits every 65 to 100 million years. The volcano goes off every 600,000 to 1 million years. What do I have to worry about? Well, we've had two close calls with species-ending events in the 20th century. The first being the Cuban Missile Crisis. If they hadn't solved it peacefully, you would have had a nuclear exchange. The war games worked out on that. 45 million Americans would have died and some 120 million Soviets. The Soviet Union would have been destroyed. The human race may have survived that one because they didn't have enough nuclear warheads or efficient delivery systems. Now let's move forward until 1983, where we had a very close call with the end of the human race. NATO was conducting a simulated Russian attack called Able Archer. All the Soviet intelligence agencies focused on this, and they said, aha, they're getting ready for a first strike on us. And the Russians contacted their mole, their deep throat inside NATO, right at the top. And he said, no, you guys are crazy. They're not. This is just an exercise. Relax. And the Soviet leadership didn't believe it. And then it got much worse. The Soviets had, these early warning satellites overhead. And one of them, one day, made a radar run and bounced off a cloud and reported to the Soviet rocket force that 5 American ICBMs had been launched, headed for Russia. We are very lucky. There was a lieutenant colonel on duty that night. He had been called in because the other man was sick. But he looked at that and he said, no, this is wrong. If they were launching a nuclear attack, it'd be hundreds of warheads and not 5. He canceled the alert. The satellite came back and picked it up again. Ultra alert, everybody up to Edward Falk was informed, and he again said, no, this is incorrect. It's a false positive. Please don't do anything. Had he not been believed, there would have been a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and at that point in life, they had plenty of warheads and plenty of delivery systems. It most likely would have been a species-ending event, okay? The poor lieutenant colonel, for his good work, he was fired from the Soviet Army and left in poverty. He wasn't sent to prison or executed, but he was disgraced as a result of saving probably all of us. The whole point is this: if a species-ending event happens, and all we have is here on Earth, we're gone. Our 12,000 years of civilization, music, culture, philosophy, literature, humanity, everything that makes us human, it's gone. It's gone. If you have a colony on a place like Mars, if the worst possible case happens, the human race continues. And that's something that we all should consider, okay? And don't ever be complacent that some species in the event is somewhere way out there in the realm of low probability or millions of years in the future. It could happen tomorrow, some pandemic, another ice age. I mean, we won't go through it. But so we need humanity on another world to make sure that our species continues. Now, how do we get to Mars? This is the next question. First President Bush ordered a big space exploration initiative, and they came up with this grandiose plan to send humans to Mars on a spacecraft that was nicknamed Battlestar Galactica. Okay? Problem was the price tag, even in 1989, 25 years ago, was $450 billion. An upstart engineer at Lockheed Martin, he didn't even have his qualification in aerospace engineering or anything. He had a PhD in nuclear engineering of all things. Dr. Robert Zubrin came up and said, wait a minute, there's a better way to do this. We only send 4 people, and before we send the humans, we're going to send a spacecraft in advance with the return rocket to bring them back. And this spacecraft will have a nuclear reactor, and it'll have the capability to make methane and oxygen rocket fuel to refuel the ship, and also the capability to make oxygen for the crew when they're there. And then when we land them, they land at hopefully the landing site, and they're all set up and ready to go. And when they're and so this cut the cost down incredibly. Okay, now getting to, and he wrote this book, The Case for Mars, in 1996. He made the cover of Time, Newsweek, all these magazines, and he formed the Mars Society. It's called Mars Direct. And when you go to Mars, okay, you have the Earth orbiting the Sun and Mars orbiting the Sun. They're very circular orbits. The problem is the Earth moves much faster because it's closer to the Sun. So you only have certain moments when you are close enough to feasibly launch a rocket. These are called conjunction pass moments, where you're about 36 million miles apart. These come roughly every 2 years, okay? And so what you would do in one cycle, you'd launch the rocket ahead of time to put all the supplies and equipment on Mars, and then you would launch at the next 2-year interval, you'd launch the 4-person human crew. Now, there's a lot of challenges. That using chemical rockets, it'll take you 6 to 9 months to get to Mars. If you go to a nuclear rocket, which they developed this as far back as 1969. It was ready to go and fly, and then President Nixon canceled it. That time goes down to 3 months. And so what you have to do, the first thing, you can't leave humans in zero gravity. Their bones and muscles start deteriorating quickly. So when you have a spacecraft, you have the spacecraft on this end, and you have a heavy weight out here called a tether. It's a long cable, and then there's a heavy weight here, and this whole thing spins, and this creates gravity, okay? Or artificial gravity, I should say. This keeps the crew. But again, you have challenges. For 6 to 9 months, you put 4, perhaps 6 human beings together in a little 2-story tin can. And you better hope that they get along beautifully, okay? I mean, you can have things, the psychologists can't answer this yet. It's how do we pick a crew that's not going to go nuts and kill each other, so on like this. The second problem you have, you're out there flying, and all of a sudden there's a major solar flare. So what they have to do in the center of the ship, they build a special shelter for the crew surrounded by water. And this, if there's a major radiation event, this protects the crew. Now, you make it all the way to Mars, you're in orbit, and the big challenge then is getting something down to the surface, okay? And some of these spacecraft will weigh 40 tons, and even the people at NASA, they admit they don't know how to do it yet. The biggest thing they put on Mars is the Mars rover Curiosity, and that's the equivalent of like having a Mini Cooper or something like that on the surface of Mars. What they had to do there is some parachutes and then a complicated rocket motor system. And on these heavier loads, parachutes don't work. You can't use just straight rocket motors. They haven't figured it out yet. So we're not going to be landing tomorrow, okay? And then the other problem with this whole idea of sending somebody to Mars, it's expensive, and as far as manned missions go, governments are not too interested in spending all that money to send humans to Mars, because it's a 10-year evolution. You know, Obama said, yeah, I'd like to do it, but he knows that he'll be out of office before anybody lands on Mars, so they pass it. They kick the can down the road, as politicians always do. Now we have a man come in named Elon Musk, and my nickname for him is the Howard Hughes of the 21st century, okay? Elon was right down at Stanford. He went over there for his PhD in physics. He stayed 1 week. He took one high-tech company public. His next effort right afterwards was PayPal, and he found himself a 20-something, young 20-something-year-old man with $160 million in the bank. And he said, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And he immediately focused himself on Mars and the Red Planet, okay? And he first went to Russia. He wanted to launch rockets to Mars, and he went over there and offered to buy some ICBMs from the surplus ICBMs from the Russians, because he was going to use that as his launch vehicles. That never worked out. And so he finally formed a company called SpaceX. At the same time, he formed Tesla Motors. You know about the Tesla cars. And he has, he's launched satellites. He's launched several cargo ships to the International Space Station. He's got a capsule called the Dragon capsule, which will take astronauts to space. And he also has a capsule that he wants to send to Mars called the Red Dragon. Now, going further, Elon is the divorced father of 5 children, and he's already indicated that when he is ready to retire, he wants to retire to Mars. Okay? And so, most likely, when we have humans landing on Mars, it will be a private company who's doing it. Okay? And what's in the works right now, in 2018, there's a project called Inspiration Mars. And they're going to take one of Elon's capsules with a man and woman crew, and they're going to do fly around the Mars and come back home. Okay? It's quite an ambitious project. It most likely would work. It's very solidly grounded in technical details, the people running it, the funding, everything, very professional. There's another a very intrepid 28-year-old Dutchman whom I've met, and he's launched a project called Mars One, okay, where he's going to put his own colony on Mars, basically using SpaceX equipment. And he put out a thing on the web, I want people ready to sign up for a one-way trip to Mars. He got 200,000 signatures of people ready to go, and he's now down to 1,058 people who are going for further training. And the way he's going to do it, he's going to start a television show like American Idol. I mean, it's pure hucksterism and commercialism. The people in the aerospace industry, they kind of roll their eyes and say, well, if it works, this is great for us, so we'll give them a chance, you know. And I had in Washington, D.C., I was in a meeting with this young man, and I gave him some fatherly advice. I said, don't let the money corrupt you. And the second thing to remember, that regardless of how hard you try and how careful you are, people are going to die. It's inevitable in any kind of exploration, even when we went to the poles and so on, and even, the space exploration we've done so far, tragically, some people die. And we try to avoid it in every way possible, but it still happens. Okay, so finally one of these days, Elon Musk is going to land a crew of astronauts on Mars and set them up in a hab. Again, you have this atmosphere of 1% of Earth. You don't have an ozone. We have a wonderful ozone layer here on Earth that protects us from most of the radiation. Mars doesn't have this. So you have to be very careful on the surface that you don't get too much radiation. And there's some people arguing that you've got to be very careful and even build the habitats and everything in the caves so they're protected from the radiation. And There are right now, north of the Arctic Circle on Devon Island, they have 2 simulated Mars bases. One is run by the Mars Society, and they're getting ready for a project this year where they're going to put a 5-person crew on 1 year to simulate a crew 1 year on Mars. Okay, and then there's also the SETI Institute, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, down in Mountain View. They also have a base right there on Devon Island also, because it's a wonderful simulation of Mars. And then the Mars Society also near Moab, Utah, they have a simulated Mars habitat where they rotate. These are 2-week crew rotations. These are not the involved things. But the most interesting thing they've learned from all those things is a lot of people get careless with their spacesuits. And if you were on the surface of Mars, that would be a fatal event. Also, a lot of your exploration will be done with these like all-terrain vehicles. And we know about all the problems with accidents here on Earth. And of course, it's a fatal event on Mars. You can't rush somebody to the hospital. If you're lucky, one member of the crew will be a doctor. Okay, and we'll have some good medical supplies, but not like a trauma room here on Earth. So it's very dangerous, and my wife complains all the time, there's no life, no noise, no animals. Why go to such a sterile and awful environment? And besides setting up that place to make sure that our species continues regardless of what happens here on Earth, there's this whole idea about finding life and answering the question, are we alone? Are we so unique and so different that we're the only thing in the universe, or is there other life and other intelligent beings throughout the galaxies and the universe, which I believe there is. The problem is that the distance to come here is incredible. They have just as a matter of interest, they have what they call a 100-year Starship program. Okay, it's to develop a starship to go to our nearest neighbor, Alpha Centauri, 4 light years away. The best starship they can come up with now goes 1/10 of the speed of light. I mean, in theory. It would take the whole energy output of the world to achieve that speed. So we're a long way from getting to the stars, and likewise other civilizations that wanted to come here to visit us, they would have to